The word landed in the courtroom the way a slap lands, fast, clean, and impossible to unfeel. My sister rose from the plaintiff's table slowly, as though she had rehearsed the timing, and she pointed at me with the certainty of someone who has already decided what the truth is. She forged it. The room went quiet instantly. My lawyer, mid-sentence, stopped speaking. The court clerk's fingers paused above the keyboard. Every pair of eyes in the gallery rotated toward me in the specific, simultaneous way that happens when someone has just said the most damaging possible thing about a person standing right there. She forged our mother's will, my sister repeated, and her voice had that practiced tremor, the one she had been using since we were children to communicate injury in a way that made people want to protect her. Gasps moved through the gallery. My throat was dry. My hands, holding a copy of the will, were not entirely steady. I looked at Kendra across the space between our tables and tried to understand how grief had become a weapon, and how she had decided to point it at me. My name is Bethany Cole. And my sister had just told a courtroom I was a criminal. The judge leaned forward. His expression was controlled, the expression of a person whose profession requires receiving shocking information without visibly reacting. That is a serious allegation, he said. My sister nodded with the appropriate solemnity of someone performing grief-stricken certainty. She manipulated our mother, Kendra said. In the last months, when Mom was vulnerable and I couldn't be there. Bethany controlled everything. My lawyer turned toward me and I gave him the smallest shake of my head. Not now. Because the thing about Kendra's allegations was that they required a specific kind of response. Not panic. Not tears. Those were her weapons and she was skilled with them. What she was not skilled at, what she had never needed to be, because I had always absorbed her versions of events in silence, was being confronted with documentation. With evidence that does not adjust itself to match a story. I had spent the last year of my mother's life sleeping in a chair beside her hospital bed, learning the names of medications and the rhythms of her difficult nights. Kendra had visited twice. She had cried beautifully on both occasions. And now she was telling a judge that I had used those years to commit fraud. My name is Bethany Cole, and by the time Kendra pointed her finger at me in that courtroom, I had spent most of my adult life being cast as the difficult one, the cold sister, the inflexible daughter, the woman who couldn't let things go. The role had been assigned to me so early and so consistently that some of the people in the gallery behind me probably believed it without question. Kendra was always better at the performance. Better at crying in the right moments, better at transforming her own selfishness into something that looked like sensitivity, better at making the people around her feel protective rather than suspicious. After our mother died, that talent had become genuinely dangerous. Grief makes people want simple narratives. It makes them want a villain they can agree on, because a villain means the loss makes sense. Kendra had understood this instinctively. She had identified the simplest villain available, the daughter who stayed, who made the decisions, who had access, and she had constructed a story in which I had used all of that proximity for something corrupt. It was not the first story she had constructed about me. But it was the highest stakes one. And she had chosen a courtroom as the stage. The dynamic between Kendra and me had been established long before either of us understood what dynamics were. Kendra had a talent that I spent years admiring before I understood it as what it actually was, the ability to convert any situation into sympathy. When she forgot a school assignment, the teacher had been unclear. When she damaged something, someone else had contributed to the circumstances. When she wanted something and didn't get it, the denial became evidence of unfairness rather than consequence. People responded to this with a kind of involuntary protectiveness. They wanted to help her, to fix whatever was wrong, to restore the warm expression her face wore when things were going in her direction. I was the opposite kind of person. I tended to take responsibility even for things that were not my fault, because I had learned early that absorbing blame was faster and easier than arguing against it. That combination, Kendra's gift for generating sympathy and my habit of absorbing conflict, had made us, as a family unit, highly functional in the short term and deeply broken in the long one. It had taken our mother's illness to show me the full cost of the arrangement, and our mother's death to make Kendra decide to collect on it. I was the responsible daughter, a category that sounds like a compliment until you understand what it means in practice. It means you are the one who stays. The one who handles the parts of reality that are unglamorous and exhausting and do not produce good photographs. While Kendra built a life 2 states away, organized to maximize her freedom and minimize her obligations, I had stayed close to our mother in the unspoken understanding that someone had to. I paid bills when things got tight. I attended doctor appointments. I learned the names of every medication and the schedule of every specialist. I organized the house, managed the finances, made the small daily decisions that keep a life running when the person who used to run it no longer can. None of this was heroic. It was just what needed doing. The thing about being the responsible daughter is that the role is self-reinforcing. The more reliably you show up, the more everyone stops considering whether they should show up too. By the time our mother became seriously ill, my being the one who handled things was so established that Kendra's absence felt, to most of the family, like a fact of geography rather than a choice. My mother's diagnosis came 3 years before the courtroom. A chronic, progressive condition, the kind that takes up residence in your life and expands steadily into every corner. I moved back home within 6 weeks. Not because anyone asked, though no one argued against it. Because the alternative was my mother managing it alone, and that was not something I could accept. The first year was difficult in manageable ways. Appointments, adjustments, learning the rhythms of a life organized around illness. The second year was harder. The third, the year she died, I understood I had been holding everything together with a sustained attention I had never previously been required to maintain. I slept in a chair beside her hospital bed in the final weeks because going home felt like abandonment, even when the nurses assured me she was stable. I was there when her breathing changed. I was there when it stopped. Kendra arrived 4 hours later, red-eyed and composed in the way of someone who had been preparing their public grief in the car. She held our mother's hand for a long time in a way that looked, to anyone watching, like the grief of a devoted daughter. She cried convincingly, she always had. Then she looked at me and suggested we get dinner. Kendra's visits followed a pattern I stopped being surprised by after the first 2. She would arrive with the energy of someone returning from an important expedition bearing the gift of their presence. She brought flowers, always nice ones. She hugged our mother for a long time and said things like "I've been so worried." In front of relatives, the effect was exactly what she intended. People looked at Kendra with the warm appreciation reserved for devoted daughters. Then she would leave. And I would go back to the prescriptions and specialist calls and middle-of-the-night moments when our mother was frightened and needed someone to sit with her until the fear passed. I did not resent Kendra for this during those years, or I did, but I didn't name it. I told myself she had her own life, her own relationship with our mother that was different from mine. I was very good at telling myself things that were technically true while missing what was actually true underneath. By the 3rd year I had stopped making those arguments to myself. By then I had simply accepted that she was not coming, and that I was staying, and that those 2 things were the arrangement we had arrived at without ever speaking it aloud. One evening in the 2nd year of her illness, my mother asked me to sit on the edge of her bed. The light was low, late enough that the house had gone quiet. She reached for my hand and held it with the grip that illness sometimes produces, stronger than you expect. "I want to talk about the will," she said. I told her we didn't need to do that now. She said she knew I didn't want to, but that she needed to, because she was someone who could not leave things she loved in an uncertain state. She had always been a woman of that specific kind of practical love. The kind that prepares, that considers, that makes sure the people she cared for would not be left without a clear record of her intentions. So I sat on the edge of her bed in the low light and listened while she told me what she had decided and why. I told her I understood even though the conversation made something ache in me that I could not have named clearly. Because talking about wills means talking about endings, and the ending was already too close. My mother's decision was careful and considered, the way all her important decisions were. The house, The home she had lived in for 31 years, that I had grown up in and returned to and spent 3 years maintaining while she was ill, she intended to leave to me. Not because she loved me more than Kendra. She was clear about that and I believed her. But because I had been the one living in it, caring for it, paying for the repairs and the taxes and the small ongoing costs of keeping a house standing. Kendra would receive the financial assets, which were substantial enough to represent a real inheritance. The division was not equal in dollar terms, but it was equitable in the way my mother understood equity. She was accounting for what had already been given and what had already been contributed, and she was trying to make the final balance fair in a way that went beyond arithmetic. I sat with her hand in mine and I thought about whether to say anything, and then I didn't. Because the decision was hers and she had made it with her whole mind intact, and arguing with it would have been a way of telling her she was wrong about her own life. A month after our conversation, my mother made an appointment with the family attorney. His name was Mr. Halcourt, and he had handled our family's legal matters for many years, a quiet, precise man who took careful notes and made no unnecessary remarks. My mother signed the will in his office, at his conference table, on a Tuesday morning in October. I was present. 2 witnesses were present, both employees of Mr. Halcourt's firm, both of whom would later provide sworn statements about her clarity and demeanor. She signed her name the way she always signed her name, with the specific pen she kept in her purse, in the deliberate cursive of someone who had been taught that signatures were a form of personal statement. Mr. Halcourt notarized it and placed it in his files. I drove my mother home and made lunch. She ate at the kitchen table and seemed lighter afterward, the way people seem lighter when they have completed something they needed to complete. I thought then that the matter was settled. That the document's existence was sufficient protection. That signed papers with witnesses and a notary constituted the kind of clarity that could not be argued with. I was wrong about that. The funeral was on a Thursday. The kind of gray winter day that feels appropriate for the occasion. Not cruelly beautiful, just quiet and cold and honest. The service was small by my mother's request. A few cousins. Her closest friends. Some neighbors who had known her for decades. Kendra stood at the front of the room in a dark coat and cried with the full, visible grief of someone in real pain. I believed, watching her, that the pain was real. I had always believed that the complicated relationship between Kendra and our mother was still a relationship, still full of something that deserved to be called love, and that grief is grief regardless of how it expresses itself. I stood next to the casket and felt the specific numbness that arrives when you have been preparing for a loss for 3 years and the loss has finally arrived. Numb is the wrong word. It was more like being very still inside. Still and heavy. Like something had stopped moving that had been in motion for a very long time. Kendra found me afterward and hugged me, and I held on to her for a moment and thought, whatever else is true between us, we are the only 2 people in this room who knew her the whole time. The will was read 2 weeks after the funeral, at Mr. Halcourt's office. My mother had left clear instructions about how it was to be handled, and Mr. Halcourt followed them with his usual quiet precision. Kendra sat across the conference table from me wearing the slightly elevated expression she wore when she expected something to go in her favor. When Mr. Halcourt reached the section about the house, when he read the line that allocated it to me, Kendra's expression changed. Not dramatically. If you had not been watching for it, you might have missed it. But I had been watching Kendra's face for 38 years and I recognized the specific micro-expression that preceded every significant reaction she ever had, a brief flattening of the features, like a storm front moving through. Her smile came back immediately, polished and appropriate. "The house," she said. I looked at her. "That's what the will says," I said. She nodded slowly, thoughtfully, in the way of a person who is absorbing information while simultaneously planning what to do with it. I saw the storm behind her eyes. I had always been able to see it. I just had not, until that moment, understood how large it actually was. The court papers arrived 23 days after the funeral. Kendra was contesting the will on the grounds of forgery and undue influence. The legal language was precise and dispassionate, the way legal language always is, but the substance of it was personal in the specific way that only accusations from family can be. She was claiming that I had manipulated our mother during her illness. That I had used my proximity to her, the 3 years I had spent caring for her, sleeping beside her, being the only person consistently present during the hardest period of her life, as leverage to produce a fraudulent document. She was taking the most significant thing I had done and repackaging it as evidence of the worst thing I was capable of. I sat with the papers at my kitchen table for a long time. Not crying. Past crying, in that moment. Just sitting with the specific weight of it. The weight of watching something true be systematically reframed as something ugly by someone who understood exactly which version of events would be hardest to defend against. I called my lawyer. Her name was Audra, and she had handled estate disputes before, and she said, "This is going to get worse before it gets better. Be prepared for that." Some relatives believed Kendra. Not because evidence pointed her way, there was no evidence, because there was nothing to have evidence of, but because belief in contested family situations is often less about what can be proved than about which story is more comfortable to hold. Kendra's story was more comfortable. It gave people who had relied on me a retroactive reason not to feel guilty, and it offered the seductive simplicity of a villain who could absorb all the confusion of a loss. I watched relatives I had known my whole life take careful steps backward, treating me at family events with the cordiality of people who have decided to remain neutral, which, in practice, looked identical to choosing the other side. Audra had warned me that character attacks and estate disputes were designed to do exactly this: isolate, destabilize, make the defendant feel so desperate for validation that they made mistakes. I tried to hold that understanding steady in the weeks when it felt like everyone had quietly decided to believe Kendra's version of me. It helped, but only partially. The part of me that had wanted to be seen accurately by people who should have known better was not something I could reason into silence. The legal process was slow. Depositions were taken. Documents were submitted for verification. Handwriting analysts examined my mother's signature on the will and compared it against decades of her other signatures, letters, checks, forms, and found no evidence of forgery. 2 analysts found this independently and arrived at the same conclusion. The witnesses present at the signing gave sworn statements about my mother's mental clarity and the absence of any pressure. Mr. Halcourt provided a full account of the appointment, his notes, his recollection, his professional assessment of her capacity and her intentions. Every piece of objective evidence pointed in the same direction. And still Kendra pushed forward, because the legal finding of no forgery was not the only arena in which she was operating. She was also operating in the family arena, and in the court of relative opinion, and in those spaces the standard was not evidence but feeling. She was considerably more skilled in those arenas, and she understood something I had not fully absorbed until the case was nearly over, that a legal victory for me was only one kind of loss for her. She had multiple theaters of operation. The courtroom was the one where I had documentation. The family was the one where she had always had the advantage. Kendra's legal argument evolved. When the forgery claim proved difficult to sustain, she shifted emphasis to the undue influence claim, the argument that I had manipulated our mother, that I had used the intimacy and dependency that caregiving creates to steer her decisions in my favor. This was the accusation that hurt more than the forgery charge, because it was the hardest to disprove and the most personal. It took everything I had done, the 3 years of showing up, the chair beside the hospital bed, the 2 a.m. calls with overnight nurses, the medications I had memorized, and reframed all of it as calculation. As strategy. As the slow, patient manipulation of a dying woman by a daughter who wanted her house. Audra told me not to take it personally, by which she meant not to let it show. The accusation was designed to produce anger, and anger would make me look like I was hiding something. I had nothing to hide. I had years of quiet, documented care and a mother who had made her decision with full clarity and full knowledge of what she was doing. What I needed, and what was hardest to hold on to through the months of the case, was the faith that those things would eventually be sufficient. The final hearing was scheduled for a February morning. I woke up at 5, which had been my pattern through the whole process, the alarm set but unnecessary, my body having decided that sleep past 5 was not something it was willing to provide during the months of the case. I drove to the courthouse in the gray early light and sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before going inside, going over Audra's instructions, going over what I knew and what I had documented and what I needed to stay steady for. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Probate court has a specific quality, quieter than criminal court, more procedural, the formality of it less theatrical and more administrative. Kendra arrived looking exactly as she always looked when she needed to make an impression, composed, appropriate, slightly wounded. She did not look at me when she sat down. Audra placed the verified will before the judge with the efficient confidence of someone who knows the documentation is solid, and I watched the judge review it, and I thought, this should be routine. This should be the part where the evidence speaks and the case is resolved. And then Kendra stood up. The silence after her accusation had a specific texture. Not the silence of a room that has heard something unbelievable, but the silence of a room that is deciding what to believe. I had spent 38 years learning the difference. The judge looked at Kendra. Then at me. Then at Audra. Then he looked at Mr. Halcourt, who had been sitting at the back of the courtroom as a witness for the estate. Mr. Halcourt stood up slowly. Your Honor, he said, in the careful way he said everything, there is one additional item that was entrusted to this court. Kendra frowned. It was not her performed frown, the one designed to communicate concern. It was the genuine one, the one that arrived when something happened outside the parameters of what she had prepared for. What item? She asked, her voice still controlled but with something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. A sealed document, Mr. Halcourt said. Left with specific instructions about the conditions under which it was to be opened. He paused. Those conditions are met. Audra turned to me. I kept my expression completely neutral, which was not difficult because I genuinely did not know what was in the envelope. My mother had kept that, at least, entirely to herself. Mr. Halcourt produced the envelope from his briefcase and placed it on the judge's bench. It was cream-colored. The kind of stationery my mother had kept in the drawer of her writing desk since I was a child, and it was sealed with red wax, which was something she did for documents she considered important. My name was not on it. No name was on it. Just the words to be opened in court, if necessary, written in my mother's handwriting. Kendra stared at it with the expression of someone recalculating rapidly. I was never told about this, she said. Her voice had a new quality in it. Not quite alarm, but the precursor to alarm, the moment before a person fully understands what is happening to them. The judge picked up the envelope and examined it. He looked at Mr. Halcourt for confirmation of its provenance. Mr. Halcourt provided a brief, precise account, when my mother had brought it to his office, the instructions she had left, the conditions she had specified. The judge examined the seal. He looked at the envelope for a moment with the quiet attention of someone who has learned to be patient with the weight of documents. Then he broke the seal. The room had gone completely still in the way that rooms go still when something is about to happen that everyone understands will matter. The judge removed several pages from the envelope. I could see them from across the room, handwritten on the same cream stationery, multiple pages in my mother's precise script. He reviewed them in silence for a moment. Then he looked up at the room. This document, he said, appears to be a personal letter from the deceased, witnessed and notarized at the time of its composition. Mr. Halcourt confirmed this from the back of the room. The judge looked at Kendra. Then at me. I'm going to read the relevant sections aloud, he said. My heart was moving in my chest in a way I was aware of but trying not to be distracted by. My mother had written this. She had sat at her writing desk or in her hospital bed or somewhere private, and she had anticipated this moment with the same methodical love she brought to everything important, and she had written the thing she needed to say. I did not know what it said. I only knew who had written it. And that, in that moment, was enough to keep me steady. The judge cleared his throat and began. My daughters, he read. The room absorbed the plural. Kendra's composure was intact but working visibly to stay that way. If this letter is being read aloud in a courtroom, then something I was afraid might happen has happened. And I want to speak to it directly, because I was not able to leave things that I loved in an uncertain state. He paused and continued. I made my decisions about my estate with a full, clear mind. I was not pressured. I was not confused. I was not frightened into anything. He looked up briefly, then returned to the pages. Bethany was beside me for 3 years. She gave up things she should not have had to give up. She was present in every way that counts, on the days that counted most. I structured my will the way I did because it reflected the truth of how things actually were, not because I was manipulated, but because the truth was exactly what I wanted my will to say. The room held very still. Kendra's hands were flat on the table in front of her and she was not looking at anyone, which was itself a kind of answer. The judge continued reading. My mother's letter described the will structure, the reasoning behind each provision, the conversations she had with Mr. Harcourt, the specific October morning when she had signed it. She wrote that she had been fully present and fully herself. She wrote that she understood the division might cause conflict, and that she had considered this carefully before proceeding. I know Kendra, the letter said, and the judge's measured voice gave the words an unexpected weight. I love her. But I also know her. And I know that if she believes herself to have been treated unfairly, she will fight for her version of events with considerable force. My mother had written the next lines in a way that required no interpretation. Let the record be clear, I made this will. I signed it in my right mind. No one pressured me. No one deceived me. The will is mine, and it says what I meant it to say. The judge lowered the pages. He looked at the courtroom over them. The court, he said, finds no evidence of forgery or undue influence. The will stands as presented. Kendra's face had gone the color of the cream stationery. What followed was not dramatic in the way of raised voices and pointed accusations. Kendra sat very still while the judge spoke. Her lawyer made a brief procedural statement that was received and noted. Mr. Harcourt confirmed the letter's provenance for the final time. Audra gathered her documents with the quiet efficiency of someone who had prepared for this outcome and was not going to perform relief about it in a professional setting. I sat at my table and breathed carefully, in the way I had been breathing carefully for months. I looked at Kendra. The performed tears had not arrived this time, which told me something about the gap between what she showed the world and what she was actually experiencing. She looked at me once, briefly, before looking away. I did not know what was in that look. I was too tired to decode it, the specific tiredness of someone who has spent months defending their integrity in a public forum. The decoding of Kendra's expressions had already cost me enough. I turned back to Audra and gathered my documents. The case was dismissed. My name was cleared. I sat for one moment and let those two facts exist without filling the space around them. The real victory was not legal. I want to say that clearly, because it surprised me, how small the legal victory felt compared to the other thing. When the judge read my mother's words aloud in that courtroom, something happened that no ruling could have produced alone. Her voice was in the room. Not filtered through my recollections, or Kendra's, or any relatives. Her actual voice, her handwriting, her sentence structure, her particular way of arriving at the center of something true, was present, addressing the people who had doubted me. Clearing my name in front of the same gallery that had watched me be accused. My mother had known this day might come. She had prepared for it with the same practical love that organized our whole lives. She had not left me only a legal document. She had left me something that could not be reframed or eroded. She had left me her own words, witnessed and authenticated, saying, I know who my daughter is. That was what I had needed. Not the house, not the ruling. The acknowledgement, formal, witnessed, in a public room, that my version of our family's story was the true one. And that my mother had made sure, before she left, that I could prove it. I moved back into the house in the spring. Not with triumph, which felt like the wrong word for what the return actually was. It was quiet. The ordinary act of a person returning to a place that had always been theirs in the way that meaning is more important than possession. I unpacked in the bedroom I had grown up in and sat in the living room evenings, letting the familiar quality of the light settle around me. Kendra and I have not spoken since the dismissal. I do not know whether we will. I hold the possibility open. Not because I have forgotten what she did, but because my mother's letter, the same one that cleared my name, was addressed to both of us. My daughters, it began. Both. Even knowing what Kendra might do, my mother had not written her out of the salutation. That choice has stayed with me. The people who try hardest to take things from you tend to underestimate the one resource they cannot access, what was entrusted to you directly, before the performance began. My mother had understood this. She had prepared accordingly. And the envelope she left behind said everything she could not say in time.